Thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Reinventing Vegetation Management. My name is Brian Hoff. I'm the Analytics Product Leader for GE Digital Grid. I'll be your host and moderator today. There's a few housekeeping rules that I need to cover. First, this session's being recorded. We'll be sending the recording out to all that have registered the webinar. Second, please enter questions using that Q&A box. If we don't answer your questions, we'll send over answers via email after the webinar. Third, please resize your window by dragging it or clicking minimize. The restore button will also reset the size. And then fourth, if you're having any issues with the webinar tool, please just refresh your browser. It should be coming in. So that's the housekeeping items. Now let's get started into our meat of today's webinar. Okay, as I previously mentioned, I'm Brian Hoff. I've got 27 years of experience in the utility industry. So I've been in this industry for a while, but what the most exciting thing is the people who I'm here to have a fun conversation with. So the first one is Hadley Doyle Gonzalez. Hadley is the president and founder of SMG Delivering Data. She got her commercial banner tow pilot and is now an aerial data expert. She's a Florida native. She works closely with utilities to solve some utilities' biggest problems, and you'll be hearing more from Hadley. Second panelist is from FP&L. It's Steve Jolly. Steve has got over 20 years of experience in vegetation management. He has spent the last 2 years focusing on technology and remote sensing initiatives. Third is Iliana Rentz. Iliana is the head of vegetation management, and she oversees vegetation management across all of NextEra Energy's assets in 44 states, 4 provinces in Canada. She has over 17 years of utility experience across multiple areas. Our last panelist is Jenna Mokino. Jenna is the Director of Product Management for Planet. She oversees the team responsible for leading the go-to-market strategy of new products in Planet's core commercial industries. Now let's get diving right into the discussion. Thank you. Let's get started. This is an exciting panel. Let's jump right into the very first question. Why reinventing veg management now? This has been a problem that's been going on for years. Why is now the right time? So I don't know, Iliana, would you start us off? Why now?
You know, Brian, that's a great question. And I think that it's one that is really 3 key drivers is the way that I think that we see it, right? At this point in time, right, technology and the innovations that have really been storming our industry over the last 10, 15 years have completely disrupted how we do business altogether as a power industry, right? And vegetation is no different, quite frankly. At this point in time, the technology and the capabilities of the technology have become more affordable as well, where we can actually leverage these technologies to make smart decisions and to be more prescriptive as to how we plan our work, right? So the technology and the timing, right? That's one. Weather events. We look at what's going on around us every year. It seems that the weather events that impact all parts of the country are more severe and quite frankly, right? So if you look at ice storms, right? The ice storms on the trees, they weigh on the trees, they cause outages. Wind and hurricanes, again, the devastation that creates to our infrastructure is huge. And wildfires, right? You look at, dry arid areas that don't have the precipitation and the wildfire exposure. And this technology will help us better prepare our systems to be more resilient as we encounter these events. And the last one is cost. I think that's the obvious one. It's a big line item on all of our P&L statements. So it's one that we need to be smarter about how we invest our dollars.
No, that helps a lot. And then, let's loop in some of our friends here. Jenna, you've got satellites circling the globe that I don't think people realize. And, there's a little bit, give us a little, what can they see? How do satellites, are they part of the technology solution?
Yeah, and I think to Iliana's point, there has been sort of a revolution in Earth observation, and Planet has been part of that. So we operate the largest constellation of commercial satellites that can image the Earth's landmass every day. So that's providing unprecedented visibility into infrastructure across the world at a really broad and, at the spatial resolution where you can see things like power lines. You can't see individual people in cars. It's not going to invade on your privacy. It's really about having more of a macro view of where assets are at any given time. And given the changes that are happening with weather and events, as well as the need to improve infrastructure, satellites are really being able to sort of help direct and guide people to where they need to invest their resources and people most. So they're sort of the first tip of something going wrong or a potential risk. They're often the best suited to capture that early.
So Jenna, give our audience, so you can't see me in my car, you said, so I'm waving out the window. You're not seeing me with your satellite, but what can you see? Can you see individual trees? Give the audience here, they're probably sitting here wondering, wait, what can she really see with these constellation of satellites?
Yeah, so I'd say that at the broad level, we have two constellations of satellites. For the medium resolution is our PlanetScope constellation that's always on, more than 180 satellites. They're going to give you the broad contours of trees and vegetation. We have a second constellation, which is the SkySat. They're much higher resolution, so you can see individual trees and actual branches that are, encroaching or falling into infrastructure. So it's really the two constellations working in tandem. Oftentimes, at the broad level, you might not be able to see that a tree is going to be falling or at risk, but you can tell the vegetation is getting drying out, or there's something going on there, but you can't really detect in fine detail what it is. So the SkySat constellation comes in afterwards to get that higher detailed picture, to get those individual tree types or species or specific branches that are falling in. So it's really the complementary nature of both that is providing value for our customers.
That helps a lot. And then Hadley, let's loop you in. I mean, let's come back to planet Earth, right? And now on-site planet Earth, what can you actually in your company do and help utilities with? Why now?
Right. And to complement, Jen and the satellites, there's the forest and the trees, right? So satellites can see big picture, give us an understanding from that broad brush. And then what we do, we use drones and manned aircraft at a, much closer to the assets or vegetation. And we can see in good detail, very, very high resolution detail. So up to, sub half an inch resolution, and our LiDAR paints a very, very three-dimensional picture of what's going on. So it's that complementary forest, trees. We might know that there's something encroaching, but we don't know exactly what it is. We could tell you what species it is. We can tell you, through certain analytics, how quickly is it encroaching. As things change over time, we can gauge how quickly it's actually encroaching. So both applications are part of the big picture, right? So it's getting us close to that real-time data intake of what we have on this, planet Earth, but both, far distance and close distance help to build that baseline and to start that understanding of, okay, we have all this data, we're collecting it. How are we making sense of it? And then, in the Jetsons age, when the satellites start creating the resolutions, that we can get close to Earth, we'll be able to handle it and make sense of it and use it to make better decisions.
But the question I think everybody's thinking right now, these things sound expensive. I heard Iliana talk in the beginning about costs have come down. Is this like R&D science projects, or are these things like really in place now? So I don't know, Steve, anything you want to say quick before anybody else in there? I'm like, is this really feasible?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been in the LiDAR space since about 2016 in vegetation management. So we've been running down this road for quite a while. And we've been using aerial imagery to do inventory on distribution. And that's a much older technology. So the ability to use imagery to begin to enhance boots on the ground information and get that information faster, get it into systems and use it. Whereas before someone would take a look at it, They would write up a prescription. It would go into a file folder, and then you'd have to go out and rediscover that tree on your next cycle, right? So now as we go through these things, we begin to explore all of the possibilities of, utilizing that data, and it's more cost effective than having a human being go look at it.
Wow. Iliana, okay, so you've got these satellites going, you got the planes flying, you've got these analytics. What's it do to a customer? Is the customer seeing benefits from this?
Absolutely, right? So the benefits to the customers is, number one, right, at the end of the day, this industry is based on base rates, right? So we are entrusted by our customers to invest and spend that money wisely, right? So leveraging these technologies also helps eliminate a lot of wasted time on boots on the ground, whereas now we're having machines and algorithms tell us what we need to do, when we need to do it, and even if we need to do it, right? There are some trees that will never grow beyond a certain length on a branch. However, if it's part of a normal cycle, it's going to get trimmed, even though it was never going to be a threat anyway to reliability or our facilities. So customers are definitely seeing a cost benefit. And in addition to that, they're having more reliable power, right? And the why there is because we're going to the right location at the right time. And when you're doing that level of tree trimming, you're avoiding future outages and as a result, providing better customer service overall.
That's awesome. And I'm sitting here thinking through what else utilities are thinking. It's like, how do I get my staff? Aren't these new technologies complicated? How did you get your teams up there? Are these things like future edge? You've got to have your IT department involved. Can a traditional veg management give an experience of the technology? And like, how does the staff adopt these? It sounds complicated.
The teams are very open to it. I'll tell you, our team here at FPL and NextEra is very excited about the technology. Where the adoption opportunities came in more than anything, and Steve definitely has a lot more background on that, is really in the boots on the ground at the crew level, right? So traditionally, right, you tell the crew, listen, here's the scope. I want you to get this much clearance. This is a line, go trim it. And they just go do that based on that general guideline. Mm-hmm. Now you're telling them, skip this tree, skip this tree, skip this tree, go to that tree. And oh, by the way, you have an application where I'm tracking you and you're going to push buttons every time you do an action. That change management definitely required adoption, but I will tell you, within the first 9 months of rolling out the initial piece of the technology, we saw a 30% difference in our execution. So it definitely, the story tells itself.
And then that's awesome. Hadley, I'm going to jump into you. There's so much technology that you're flying with. Like, it's incredible. Can you give the audience a little bit, like, kind of the geeky, what's some of the tech that you're dealing with?
Sure. So we started off with drones, really, and as disruptive as they were, to us they were the kickoff of what got a lot of utilities excited about this higher resolution. We could get more data, and drones kicked it off. Right, we were so close to the assets, we could see everything. But they just don't scale well, and eventually they will. But the FAA slow rolls everything, so it's taking its time to incorporate drones of small, medium, large sizes into the national airspace. So they don't just scale well. So we have the unique ability of flying both manned and unmanned aircraft. And what we found with the manned side is that not only can we hold much, larger sensors, which mean better resolution, but we can carry multiple of them, and we can carry, the best internal measurement units, IMUs and GNSS. So our data is highly accurate as far as, geospatially located. We like to call our aircraft pickup trucks. We can carry pretty much anything in any kind of, scenario. So typically we fly LiDAR, which gets us, 400 points per square meter on average, which is about 8 times higher than what's normally standard. We fly 150 megapixel imagery, which gets us sub-inch GSD on the ground, and thermal, for utilities, and hyperspectral and multispectral, specific for vegetation. So we're taking in all this data all in one flight, highly accurate. So, and this data doesn't self-destruct, when we use it. So it's there, and multiple business units can tap into it. The resolutions are getting higher that engineers can pull data from it, not just vegetation, but reliability, hardening programs. The data's there. It's at resolutions that all business units can use. So there's a push of internal utilities to, speak to each other in each business department, in each business unit, and kind of come up with a joint plan of how to use the data. And try not to skimp on resolutions. That's what we always say, because the ability's there.
That's interesting. Jenna, anything you want to add on the tech part to this conversation before we transition?
Yeah, I think that what's really exciting is that things are getting better in all these different fields. And you asked earlier, why now? I think it's this confluence of technologies. So you don't have to rely on one or the other. You don't have to choose, because costs are coming down for everyone. And so what you're getting is this ability to leverage drones, leverage LiDAR, leverage satellite. And hopefully when you're the customer, being able to find a solution that incorporates all of these different data sources, so you don't have to buy them one by one, and really be able to leverage machine learning on top of that data to extract those insights to tell you and help make that decision. Because it's really, at the end of the day, not about the imagery or the data, whether it's from drone or satellite. It's about the insights that come together when all of them are in one place and, filtered through a solution. So I think that's the why now. We're closer to that solution phase as opposed to just pure technology phase.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And, it'll help me kind of in this transition. Steve, I'll have you start this one off for us. I'm sitting here imagining utilities are listening right now, in the US or on the globe, and they're thinking, I'm in this journey. How do I get started? What advice would you give somebody who's either early or middle into this from all the experiences you guys have had? Where do you start?
Well, I think benchmarking is really important. So reaching out to your partners in the utility industry, making sure that you guys are on the same path, you have similar use cases, and really getting a lot of feedback and lessons learned from other folks who are doing some things in that space. I also think, and Hadley mentioned this, is talking internally with the other departments, so to make sure that you're aligned on what are our use cases for data like this. What data should we really go chase? What's the biggest bang for our buck, and how can we share it amongst all of these different departments and share that cost and learn from it together? So those are, I think, the best ways to get started, and then just do some proofs of concept.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, and then Iliana, I'm going to have a little bit more of the 50,000 foot. Do you see sharing any of this with other utilities? Do you see sharing best practices outside the utility sector? What do you see?
I think that as far as from an industry perspective, we're only as good as we are as an industry, right? So as I am a 100% proponent in sharing best practices and collaborating with other companies, sharing our lessons learned and our successes. And don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? If somebody has solutions for anything, for encroachment on X, let's just say, let's just go with that, right? Let's share, and we're one team. Ultimately, we're one team responding to our customers, just in different parts of the country.
I think it's fair. And then Hadley, same question goes out to you, right? Utility calls you and says, hey, I just watched this webinar that just hit all these people. I'm inspired. I want to start tomorrow. What piece of advice do you give them?
I think to echo what Steve said, to really understand not only, you know, what's the scope right in front, but what's the 5-year plan, and how to use this data. What are the true analytics? And also what Jenna said, you know, it's not just one sensor, you know, data set. It's the multimodal approach and how they overlay, and even just, you know, bringing in an overlay of precipitation and how does that affect, you know, vegetation. We have all this data. So I would say make sure that there's an internal team of GIS experts, maybe some LiDAR analysts, just to help, you know, navigate the new waters. You know, there's a lot of young and you know, existing people who know way more on technical sides than most of us. So to tap into those team members that most utilities already have, and just understand what's the end goal, what's the 5-year plan, and lay the bricks to get there.
Yeah, and I just want to double down on one thing I just heard you say that I think is so interesting. I'd almost challenge every utility has that group of people who want to be involved with this. This technology is cutting edge. It's exciting. So tap into, for those people listening to us right now, to that org. Find the people who want to be part of the change. You'll be excited that when you find out, like, here's this great problem, here's some new technology, that they're going to help drive you forward. And I've seen that myself in the career. And, you know, I love that you just use as an example, is tap into those, you know, people in your own company. Right? You don't need to go out and get all these outside experts. You've got people inside that really want to drive. And then Jenna, what do you think? What's the piece of advice you're going to give?
Gosh, everything that I would advise has been stated, but I would just say keep an open mind and be open to change, open to changing your practices, because what we've seen with our customers is they come to us with a very specific problem, but they find that they're able to solve many different problems that touch many different departments with satellite data. And so just keeping that open mind and that exploratory curiosity, as well as having that 5-year plan and identifying those, you know, influencers and change makers within the org. What you'll typically find is that what you were seeking is probably much larger or could be solved different ways. So just be open to that possibility that the problem you think you have is actually not what it really is, because you'll discover more. So that would be my advice.
Is there any, and this is awesome, we're almost towards the end here of our session. And the thing that I keep thinking through, again, what else are people thinking as they're listening to us? What advice do you say if I don't want to do anything? I'm just going to keep doing veg management the same way I've done for the last 100 years. What are going to happen to those utilities? Any predictions for if you don't reinvent, if you continuously just do it the same way, what happens? Are they like the dinosaurs? Are they, what's going to happen to those utilities?
I'll jump in. I think that would work in a static environment, but so much of our weather, our environment, is changing quicker, you know, almost as fast as the technology's changing. So if you don't reinvent, if you don't take a different approach, the results aren't going to come out the same, right? So utilities really need to look at what's changing around all of us here on planet Earth, and we see that well from satellites. Thank you, Jenna. And you know, adopt, try to gauge, be predictive and proactive rather than reactive. You know, even water inundation. You know, we have so many things that we're facing that are new or more exasperated now. So highly advised to take a different approach, keep an open mind, and try new things.
I think that's right. Iliana, you actually said some of that in your very opening statement, right? When you started off this session, you started talking about the reason, right? Climate's changing, here's the reasons. So that was an awesome tie back to how we started this. But any other advice you'd have, what's going to happen to these utilities that don't do anything?
Again, I'll go back to, you know, we have a responsibility to our customers to continue to change, to grow, to innovate, to wisely invest and use the rates that they're paying for electricity, right? And the reality is that this technology, the change with it isn't linear. We all know it, right? It's exponential, and if you don't get ahead of it, it's gonna be a really tough time to catch up. And eventually, even, you know, the equipment and the materials that we're using on our systems is evolving to support these technologies. So, you're going to have access to equipment, just core base equipment that you haven't set forth an infrastructure to capitalize on. So change is good, and it's here to stay, and the technology is really changing the way we make decisions every day.
Yeah. Jenna, Steve, I think a lot's been said. Any final things you're thinking?
I mean, I think I would just echo what's been said in the sense of, from our perspective at Planet, when we work with utilities, we don't see that resistance to change, actually. We see a lot of interest and need and a little bit more hesitation or confusion on how to go about it. Mm-hmm. So I actually don't think it's really about changing minds that this needs to happen. It's more about helping guide them. And that's why I think this webinar is getting to that point of really guidance and sharing information, because that's more where we are in this evolution than sort of trying to change dinosaur attitudes, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Steve, last words here.
No, I would agree. I think most people are very excited to see the technology and see what others are doing, and learn more about how to get it going for themselves. So that's been my experience.
No, thank you. And I want a couple things here, just for anybody who's listened to on the webinar right now. I just want to thank you for your time. I'm seriously was so lucky to be able to host this panel. These are real leaders in the industry who are reinventing vegetation management. So hopefully you've got something out of this webinar. We got a lot out of this conversation. So thank you for my panelists, and take care. And that's the end of our show. Thanks again for everybody who's been putting in questions to date. Now's the time. If you have a question that we haven't answered or you haven't typed in, please type in your question in the Q&A, and we'll try to get through all the questions. Thank you. Let's get started. All right, great questions are coming in. I see a couple dozen, so everybody please keep asking questions. I'm going to actually start. I see one from Sweden, and the one from Sweden is definitely standing out to me. Iliana, I'm going to ask you to take this one. It's really about the change management that we talked about on our panel. It is, how do the contractors, the boots on the ground, and management accept this new way of thinking and working?
Including them in part of the development, the deployment, the training. Right. I found that, the team did a really nice job in inviting our partners to designate personnel within their companies to attend the deployment and development sessions, to help us with feedback on ways to improve the technology to make their job easier. Right. So that to us was a catalyst really in what set the tone for the eventual success of the tool. And, at this time in this juncture where we are in our deployment plan, the feedback that we're getting from the vendors is, I don't know how we would continue to do business now that we know that we have this without having access to these technologies.
That helps. And thank you. There's a lot of questions I keep seeing. I'm going to try to group up, about 5 or 6 of these together, where people are really questioning, how does LiDAR data really assist? So, I'm thinking a lot through Steve. Why don't you start this conversation about how we're merging and how the different data sources together and why LiDAR? And then Hadley, I'll have you jump in too, because I think you can provide a lot of view into this.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think, so first of all, why LiDAR? I think LiDAR has been very important for us to really build out that 3D digital twin around our lines, not just for the poles and wires. One of the things that we're finding is, with working with a lot of our vendor partners and talking to our folks in house, is poles and wires are actually pretty easy to identify. It's that dynamic environment around the poles and wires that is really the challenge. So really getting at our distribution area, drilling into that specifically with LiDAR, understanding where those canopies are and how they're changing over time has really been the key for helping us out. And I know there was another question about, work management and how that's involved here as well. So once we get this LiDAR in-house, we can begin to understand, where the trees are, what side of the line they're on, which direction the wind is blowing that might affect those trees on that side of the line. We can understand routing. We can understand work volume. So how much tree is there to be trimmed? How much of it is in that sort of, in space around the line that we want to trim back to, and we can route our crews accordingly. So that's really the lift that LiDAR gets us above and beyond everything else, and we have that system of record that we can base future analytics on instead of an inspection form that's in a file folder somewhere.
Hadley, do you want to jump in? Yeah. 1 second, Hadley, we have you muted somehow. Hadley, I think we're good.
Let's try now. We good?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we use imagery, and to us, that's our horizontal cues. But LiDAR really is that vertical cue for us. So we always collect LiDAR and imagery together. We find them to work in tandem to not only help us understand, the vegetation, the fallen, right? When we have a fallen, it's not just falling sideways, right? It's growing up, it's growing out. So it really has to have that three-dimensional spatial, awareness, and LiDAR definitely fills that in. But the imagery also plays a huge part in not just the vegetation piece, but, LiDAR is a whole bunch of points, and they are very dense from what we have. But sometimes it's difficult for either machine learning or human eye to be able to identify a capacitor bank versus a cross arm with just points. So that imagery always helps when it's called colorizing the LiDAR. It makes that three-dimensional twin a three-dimensional model using the imagery to colorize those points. So they really work well together, but LiDAR is very important for vegetation.
Yeah, and Jen, I'm going to loop you in. There's a couple questions here. I think some of the audience has questioned, like, what's the frequency of planet scoping? So help people put it in context, right? We just kind of re-explained why the LiDAR. And then again, I always like to think of it as the layers, right? We need each of these layers as part of the solution as we build these AI models. But explain to people again, what does Planet provide? What's the frequency? What's the resolution? Because I can see some questions in here.
Yeah, sure. So I think our Planet Scope constellation can image the entire Earth's landmass every day. So if you're a utility provider and have infrastructure, we can see across those lines in very remote and far-reaching geographic areas on a very high frequency. So, and oftentimes there's weather, so you'll need multiple captures in that week, or time period to get it. So that's at medium resolution, so closer to 3.7 meters. That is oftentimes that horizontal broad brush picture view. And our SkySat satellites are closer to 50 centimeter resolution. And that's what's going to give you the contours of the trees and branches in more depth. That's nowhere near what a drone can do, but really our advantage is sort of the scale and global coverage, so that if you're not just going to be managing one set of lines, you're going to be managing multiple ones across large areas. So we're really like the tip off of an event that you can fill in with more detail with drone and of course with LiDAR bringing it in. So that layered cake is really what is going to give you the best use of your investments in people and direction and insights.
Yeah, and I see a couple questions here. Iliana, I'm going to let you take this one about, wait, is this really only for transmission? I don't see how this works for distribution. Because again, your programs, again, across your huge geographical area that you cover, answer for the audience here, if you would, is this only for transmission?
It is not, no. So, and that was a great question. I did see that in the Q&A box. So we actually started our journey with LiDAR on transmission in 2016. And what the team was able to do was essentially convert our program from a scope-based program to a very prescriptive design-based program. And within the first year, 50% of the defects were reduced in our data. And the subsequent second year, there was an incremental 15% reduction of defects, and year over year, the defects continue to decline, and it is a stable process, right? So our transmission on the regulated utility side is 100% LiDAR based. We capture LiDAR twice a year on all of our NERC assets and once a year on our non-NERC assets. On the distribution side, it has gotten to a point now where the point cloud data and can resolve and show encroachment very well on feeders and laterals in full disclosure. When you have very dense vegetation, or where you may have laterals that are completely surrounded in vegetation, right, it requires vectorization of lines because the LiDAR may not be able to permeate the trees and the canopy to be able to resolve the encroachment. So there are, right, we're still growing and we're learning. That's part of all of these projects as you continue to develop them. But it's definitely at a point where it is a game changer now for distribution as well.
Steve, I see a call out directly to you, and it's a, hey, can Steve tell us about collecting LiDAR with mobile devices from the ground? I think that's a question here. Question for Steve, are you also using mobile in addition to the stuff that we're doing with man and fixed wing?
So for the vegetation space, we are not currently using ground-based LiDAR, although we do have some pilots that we want to do, and we're getting those queued up. I think they'll be maybe at the end of this year, early next year, to do some ground-based LiDAR. So it is something that we're looking at, but the primary method for collection has been aerial collection from either a fixed wing or a drone. I know, and Hadley can speak to this a bit as well. One of the things that we've been working on is making sure, our flight lines are structured such that you can get more oblique angles. So instead of shooting straight down, you shoot at an angle a little bit so that you can see, the poles better. You can see the trunks of some of the trees, and so that's been helpful. So I think, we're definitely going to look at it, but we're not currently doing it for distribution vegetation.
Thanks. And Hadley, jump in here and explain to it. I'm always fascinated when you talk about being a pilot and some of the things that you've learned on capturing data. I mean, I can listen to you for hours. You want to give a couple minutes about some of your experience on capturing data?
Yeah, it's I don't get to fly as much anymore, but understanding.
Hey, and I want to go with you sometime, so hopefully that's fine.
Well, we'll jump. Let's go. We'll do the coastline. The collection process, everybody. We can use an FPL aircraft, right? The collection process has, really developed as the technology. We fly much lower and slower than what was typically the standard of any kind of aerial data collection. Which is, very exciting because we really do try to simulate how a UAS would fly without the limitations of, a BV loss waiver or swap and battery limitation. So we do our best to use all the benefits that a UAS provides, but without any of the limitations. So that's how our aerial data collection has really evolved. And, for us, since we carry so many sensors under the aircraft at once, it's choosing, what we call what's the least common denominator. What's the sensor that needs to be the highest resolution? It's typically the thermal sensors. They are a little bit, I guess maybe not used as much, so that the technology hasn't been pushed that far. So we typically fly for our thermal side. But I mean, it's flying. You know, there's nothing too crazy about it. Just a little bit lower and slower than what has been done before. And to kind of comment on what Steve was touching on with the mobile LiDAR, the technology has really advanced so much that we now have resolutions from the air that are very close, if not complementary to mobile-based, ground-based LiDAR data collection. So we do partner with a lot of the mobile LiDAR data collection companies for backlot, for transmission, for those areas that mobile units just can't get to. And what we do there is we really fill out the utilities infrastructure. So just to fill in those gaps. But in the past, the aerial resolutions weren't good enough, and they just didn't complement mobile LiDAR. But technology has changed.
Yeah, and so I see that the next grouping of categories, what I'd call it, is there's a lot of policy and regulation questions coming at us. And I'm going to have Iliana, if you don't mind, probably start, and then everybody else think about this a little bit, because there's the utility kind of regulations, right? There's the FAA regulations, right? There's Jenna, probably regulations you're working with. So I think there's a lot of different regulation questions that we could answer. But Iliana, do you want to kind of kick off? First, I saw a simple, what is NERC, right? And then there is a little bit more of how is this in regulations impacted?
So from a regulatory perspective, we do not necessarily require regulatory approval to implement these technologies within our work processes. That being said, we do file annual plans with our respective commissions, which do describe our programs. In the description of the programs, we include LiDAR technologies and moving into more technology-based programs, right? So I'll say, because this is all public, so for Florida Power and Light for 2022 and 2021, we've been doing it. Our filing includes the language around using LiDAR for transmission vegetation management in that program, right? So on the distribution front, we have not yet included that and are in conversations as to when the right time to begin introducing that will be on our regulatory filings. So, and this technology too, right? So we're talking a lot about LiDAR, but there's also a tremendous use case for satellite imagery. We have a lot of assets that might be out in desert areas that, because of our compliance requirements, we have to visit them on an annual basis, not to exceed 18 months, right? And with that, to that end, does satellite suffice for that where there is no vegetation around your transmission lines to be able to do change detection with a level of certainty that you are not introducing risk on the transmission front? So the regulatory landscape, again, it's very different in every state, but ultimately I think that there's enough latitude there that if your utility is thinking about introducing this technology, there's a right way to introduce it into your programs, and there's definitely an application for it within the overall program descriptions that I think that your regulators would see as a benefit, cost benefit, and reliability benefit, and safety benefit to the customers we serve.
No,
Yeah,
awesome. Great question, or great answer. Yeah, go ahead, Jenna.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the satellites don't have as much scrutiny from a regulatory perspective than maybe drones with the FAA. But I think it is, like Iliana said, it is becoming a tool to just as evidence of compliance with policy that, care has been done or, trimming has been done to just sort of prove in these remote areas that activities have been completed in a timely fashion. Like, our data actually is supporting evidence of that. So I think it is, using the right combination of technologies, satellite could play a good role in just the compliance side.
And Brian, if I may, I didn't answer the first part of your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You asked me what NERC was. So NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. It is for those of you outside the United States, NERC is it's essentially a regulating and compliance entity whereby any transmission assets that are either 200 kV or above or deemed critical to the bulk electric system can be deemed a NERC line. An at-fault outage to NERC facilities can bring fines of up to $1 million a day per occurrence. So it is something that utilities take very seriously, and we as NextEra have a no risk tolerance on our transmission. Sorry.
No. Thank you. Thanks for interrupting. Yeah, I think we had some listeners who wanted to make sure they knew that. And Jenna, I'm going to answer a question for somebody before we let Hadley answer. Somebody was asking about, hey, how about, are you launching more satellites? And I think you can go out and Google and find, right? You guys are launching more satellites, higher resolution all the time, right? But again, is that a fair, quick answer?
Yeah, it's a quick answer that we are always replenishing our existing fleets, but we also have plans for an even higher resolution tasking satellite, higher resolution than SkySat, as well as a constellation of hyperspectral satellites. So from a vegetation perspective, even more spectral information about the types of vegetation there is. So yes, lots of exciting developments when it comes to spacecraft and launches coming up for Planet.
All right, so Hadley, you're the last on regulations, and again, I know you deal with quite a few regulations yourself in your what guidance do you want to provide on regulations?
Well, we deal with more on the FAA side. So if it really depends on what's the baseline of the utility, do they have an existing flight department? Is this a task that they're going to take on internally? I know some of our utility clients have, very advanced, robust flight departments with them themselves. So that's the compliance that we deal with and regulation. Really just opening the door, setting all the safety cases, reporting a lot to the FAA of, our standing operating procedures, any kind of incidents. All of our flight data gets sent to the FAA. Utilities will also have to do that if they stand up their own internal flight departments. But as we get closer, we fly drones and airplanes, but the future will fly drones that look like airplanes. So they'll be, very large. They're called Group 2 UAVs. So that's where we really focus on, is not focusing so much on the smaller, it's called 55 pounds and under UAVs, but the larger groups. That's where we see real impact on being able to update that digital twin of an infrastructure on a daily basis. So that's where we focus on our regulatory pushes.
No, thank you. Any last, we're about out of time. I was going to say, you guys have all seen the chat. Any other questions in here that anyone's dying to answer that I didn't ask you?
I think there's a question around AI and ML being used to analyze imagery at scale. And I think it's a really good point, because with all these new sensor technologies, you're not going to have enough people to manually process and extract insight from that. So the advancements in AI and ML are absolutely critical to the processing and understanding of satellite data in particular, because given the frequency that we're collecting, you would have to have people, which you won't, like looking at imagery all day. And that's just not feasible. And so having machines look at it and being able to make those pixel level detections of vegetation and help the health of the vegetation too, is going to unlock a lot of the value. And it's absolutely being used today, because there are limitations for how much humans can actually, absorb. So yes.
Yeah, I don't think I want the job either, Jenna, to sit there and just look at these pixels every single day. So no, thank you for pulling that out. All right, anybody else? Because I'll say, I think here's where I just want to wrap with is, first, everybody who's listening, thank you for your time. We're going to make sure that we see any questions. We have this recorded. The recording can go out. I saw that was a question. This panel, thank you for joining. You guys are experts in this field. You really are reinventing. It's an enjoyable part of my job that I get to work with you all every day. So thank you so much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
end of our webinar.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.